We've seen previously how we could add model objects like add a new flight or a new passenger to our database through the admin application. However, we'll be seeing in this video how we could add, let's say, a passenger via the web page without having to go to that admin's site, because as you know, the user won't have access to go to that admin page. That page is only used for the programmers to visualize the database. However, as a user, you want to add information using the web page only. And so in order to do that, the first thing I need to do is add a form into my flight.html page. So it shows me the passengers that are already in my flight, and below that I'm going to first add a heading that says add passengers, and below it I'm going to add a form that's going to let me add the passengers that I want. So form, and of course that form is going to take whenever I submit that form is going to go with that specific URL that is specified inside of that action, and that URL is going to be specified through the name, and so it's called book that we'll be creating in a moment. So let's go ahead and close that, and now we have that URL. And now we're going to add all the necessary information inside of that form. So let's just go ahead and add that URL, which is book, which is in urls.py, and so that path is going to be that flight that I would like to access. So flight ID, which might be 1 or 2 and so on, /books. So that flight which is in here, I'm going to access it, and then I'm going to book a passenger to that flight. And so whenever I go to that URL, I'm going to go to views.book, which is a function I'm going to be creating in a moment, and name equals to, let's say, book. Let's add a comma. And so now we've added our URL. Let's go back to flight.html. And so one thing we need to add to our URL is that flight ID, because we want to book a passenger into a specific flight, and so we need to add that argument, because inside of our path it's already as a parameter. So if we want to use that URL anywhere, we need to pass by also that flight ID parameter. So inside of flight.html, I'm going to enter that ID, which is flight.id, because flight is a variable that I can access, so I can access its ID. And so now I need to also add a method to my form, and that form is going to be a post, because I'm going to be submitting information. And whenever I have a form in Django, I need to add a CSRF token. So this is one of the most important things we need to add, just for security, to make sure that your form is really valid, as in you are submitting the form and not someone else. And now let's go ahead and add a drop down list, which we can use in HTML, and we could create easily. So select field, we'll give it a name of passenger, so the user knows that I'll be adding a passenger, and the ID is going to be actually that's important. So now inside of my select, I would like to add all my options, as in all the passengers that I could select from them, and add them to my flight. And in order to do so, we need to have access to all the passengers that are not on that flight. And in order to do so, we need to go to views.py and create our book function. So you recall in urls.py we specified the route and specified that whenever we go to that route, I'm going to be going to views.book. And so we haven't yet created that book function, so let's go ahead and create it. So I'm going to create that book function, which is going to take as an argument not only the request but the flight ID, because if we see the path, we can see that that function needs to have a flight ID as a integer, as a variable integer variable. And so now inside of that function, what the first thing we'll do is to first get that flight. But remember from before that there are multiple ways that I can access I can request a web page. So before I get that flight, I can request a web page via the get request method. So when you enter a URL into the web page, you are actually requesting a web page via that get method, or I can request that method via post, meaning I would like to send data to the page. And generally speaking, anytime we want to manipulate the state of something, especially manipulating our database, that should be inside of a post request. I'm submitting some data, and in response to that post submission, you should manipulate what's going on inside of that database. So going to first check when this book route is called upon, a different request method is post. The request method is going to be post. So we're going to be requesting that method, which is going to have to be equal to post. So the request has a method, and this method should be post. And the first thing we need to do is to get that flight. So flight equals to flight dot objects dot get primary key equals to flight ID, which I have access to. And so now I get my flight. And now what I'd like to add now is that so when someone submits this form to book a new passenger on a flight, you should tell me what the ID of that passenger is. What passengers should I book on that flight? Because these two are pieces of information that you need to do in order to book a flight. You need the flight and the passenger information. So now we have the flight and we only need the passenger's ID. And so inside of my HTML, we've created that passenger name, and we're going to be selecting from this list of passengers. And so inside of that function, I'm going to inside of that form first, I'm going to submit that form and submit with it the name, so the passenger name, which is here. So that would be submitted inside of my form. And so now I can just go ahead and request dot post, as in whatever I've submitted, which happens to be called passenger, pass it to here. And we're going to be fixing the HTML whenever in a moment, to have it give us an ID instead of giving us the first and the last name of the passenger. So for now, let's just give it a name of ID, and that ID is going to be saved by writing the command, which is request.method dot post of a variable called passenger, which is inside of our form. And so this might be a string, and we want our ID to be an integer. So let's just go ahead and put it inside of a built-in function called int, which is going to convert it into an integer. And in order to get the passenger, the same way I used flight.objects.get pk of flight ID, I'm going to be doing the same. Passenger is going to be passenger dot dot objects dot get. However, I don't want to get sorry so I don't want to get the passengers with that are on that flight. I want passengers that are not on that flight, and we'll see how we could do that in a while. However, you can see now that we have a yellow line below passenger, and that's because we did not import that passenger class. So let's just go ahead and import it, and now it's working fine. So actually we're just going to be adding for now just one more passenger, and so passenger equals to passenger dot objects dot get, and this is the ID, so pk equals to int, and so this is going to give us the primary key. And so now what we'd like to do is add that passenger to that flight, and so in order to do so, I'm going to be accessing that passenger's flights. And so in order to do that, I can say passenger, which is the one that I just got, dot flights dot add, and so I'm going to add that flight. And so flights is that variable in the models that we've created, which is going to give me all the flights that the passenger is on, and that flights.add is going to add that flight, the table of flights, into that table of flights. And so now what I'd like to return is a HTTP response redirect, and then reverse to let Django get me that URL, and so reverse book, and so whenever I add a new passenger, I want to return to that same page. And so because book requires from us to a parameter, which is the flight ID, reverse flight, so reverse flight, I want to return to that flight which has all the information about the flight. And so since that flight also requires a parameter, I'm going to add a comma, and it takes an argument of flight ID, and I'm going to add a comma because this is a tuple. So in order to know that this is a tuple, I need to add a comma. And now the last thing I need to do is to import from Django.http. I'm going to import that HTTP response redirect, which is right here, and from Django.urls I'm going to be importing reverse. Save that. And so now if I go back to flight.html, you're saying that we need to get all the passengers that are not inside of our plane or flight, and so in order to do so, inside of inside of flight, which is the main page we are on, I'm going to be passing another parameter aside from the passengers, which is the non-passengers. And so non-passengers is going to be all the passengers that are inside of my passengers table, excluding those that are inside of my flights, which is flight. So flights is a variable inside of that class, which is the passenger class. So let's just add a comma, and I want to exclude all the passengers that don't have this flight inside of their flights variable. And so that's passenger, not passengers. And so now I've added a parameter to my flights flight.html, which are the passengers that are not on that flight. And now inside of flight.html, I can create a for loop first. So for every non-passenger inside of my non-passengers list, I'm going to give an option which is generally inside of our option, and the option value is going to be reading the passenger's ID, because ultimately when I submit the form, what I care is about what the ID is, which is the user's ID. Of course, the users who are looking at the page, they don't want to see the IDs. They want to see people's the people's names, and so the value is going to be the ID, and the one appearing to the users is going to be the passengers themselves, the name of the passengers. And so we're going to so we'll remove the non-dash because dash we cannot use it. So now the value is going to be passenger.id. So that's the ID, and here we're just going to be plugging in passenger, which is going to give us the first and last name. So let's go ahead and save that. And one last thing we need to do, because we changed that to underscore inside of use.py, we need to change that too. So let's go ahead and save. And now let's refresh our page, go to the first flight, and now you can see that we have a new section, which is the add passengers, in which we can choose from all the passengers that we have inside of our passengers list. So here are all the passengers that are not on that flight that we can add. So let's say I add Tris Prior, and we can notice we forgot to add a submit button, so let's just go ahead and add it. So inside of that form, I'll be adding a an input of type submit. So that's the input of type submit, and that's it. So let's go ahead and save and refresh. And now let's say I address prior and submit. Okay, so now we have a multi-value dict key error, and so you can see that the error is right here. So let's go ahead and see why it's giving us that. And so we're requesting from that form a name called that has the name passenger, a variable which has the name passenger. So let's go to fly.html, and inside of our value, select name is passenger. So that's the problem. So they have to have the same name, because when we're taking that passenger that we selected, we have to use the name holding that variable, so they have to be the same name. So the passenger is the same of that here. And so now if we go ahead and one last thing, I just forgot to add that dot all. So because it's passengers.objects.all, but excluding flights equal to flight. So now if we go ahead and refresh our page and add Tris Prior and submit, I can see that now I have Tris Prior as my passenger. And you can see that we are redirected to this page using that HTTP response redirect. Let's say you can see that now Tris is no longer on my list because she's already on that flight. Let's say I add Caleb, and now I have Caleb and Tris on my flight. And so you can see how we are able to manipulate those data without actually going to that admin app. We were able to add those passengers to our database in that web page through that views.html, through that function which is inside of our views.py that helped us enter data from our web page to our database. And so that's it for that video.